Hello, welcome to the Rhode Island Small Business Coalition's Small Business Forum. I'm your host, David Dadekian, a small business owner here in Rhode Island. I own Eat Drink Rhode Island. And as always, it's great to have another guest to interview this week. If you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube or anything like that, please like and subscribe, things of that nature, but also check out risbc.org. That's risbc.org. That's the Small Business Coalition's website where you can sign up for our newsletter, see everything that's going on, follow all our social there, of course, as well, and watch back episodes of these shows. So today's guest is David Segal, and let's welcome David in. He is running for Congressional District 2 here in Rhode Island.
Indeed. Should I say more? Or
sorry, we had a slight delay there on the technology. It's just not treating us right today. Why don't you start off again there, David? Welcome.
Thanks very much for having me.
We're glad to have you. Glad to talk small business issues with you as you run for Congress. I'm sure it's an interesting time you're dealing with here. Why don't we start with since you are a candidate for the former Congressman, well, he's not former yet, but Congressman Jim Langevin's seat, Congressional District 2 here in Rhode Island. Why don't we start off with telling us a bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, sure thing. So I first got into politics 20 years ago this summer, running for city council in Providence, and served on city council for 4 years. So obviously a lot of interaction with the small business community during that period. Which we can talk about in a bit. And then I went on to serve in the State House for 4 years, representing downtown, Jewelry District, Fox Point, parts of College Hill, and some of East Providence. And so again, an area with a ton of business activity, small, medium, and large. And for the past 10 years or so now, I have been running a federal-facing nonprofit that does policy and organizing work. And we work on a whole bunch of different issues, but one that I think is probably most relevant here is on pushing back against corporate monopoly power and trying to protect consumers and small businesses and workers from the various predations perpetrated by the biggest companies in the world that have been getting bigger and bigger over recent years, frequently at the expense of local businesses and the communities in which they're situated. True. And so you can think of me as somebody who, for the last 20 years, has been pushing back against corporate special interests and their influence over government and over our economy. And again, frequently that comes at the expense of the businesses we're going to be talking about and the communities that surround them, consumers and workers and so on.
So what drew you to want to run for Congress?
Well, like I said, I've been doing this work for quite a while now, and literally every day or almost every day for the last 20 years, I have gotten up and tried to figure out how I can make a difference, push forward I am progressive, push forward a progressive priority, and the impediments to those priorities, whether we're talking about dealing with climate change or instituting universal health care or fairer taxes or workers' rights or pushing back against monopolies as such, is overwhelmingly the influence of these corporate special interests over our system. And I think that this moment calls for people who have track records of doing that kind of work, of pushing back against those forces and trying to make progress for everyday people. And so that's why I'm running for Congress.
Sounds great. Thank you. So, but before we dive into the small business issues, a question I have to ask, since I almost feel silly that I have to ask this question, but we have interviewed several of your opponents, and we've got some more interviews coming up. Do you live in District 2?
I do. I'm talking to you live from Federal Hill.
All right. Thank you. As I said, seems odd to have to ask that question, but I know not all of them do at the moment. So Federal Hill, I mean, you're right in the heartbeat of a lot of small businesses there in Providence. I was just up there on Friday. Even in this summer heat, it's a bustling and busy area. Tell us, as you said, you're city council, you're in the General Assembly for a while. What's been your interaction with small business here in Rhode Island? What's your experiences?
I mean, it's everything you can imagine, from infrastructural questions to, and there was a lot of, I was representing the parts of town that were most impacted by the highway move, for instance. Yep. So a ton of all of the usual stuff, how people are relating to their communities. Sometimes the small business has a complaint about what's going on in the community around them. Sometimes community members have a complaint about what might be happening on a business corridor. Of course, there's a lot of opportunities to work together and better the community for everybody involved. And that ranges from everything from tree planting to where there's going to be a curb cut to public transit to broader infrastructural questions like the nature of the highway move to why these like big businesses from out of town are getting tax breaks, but people who run smaller businesses or medium-sized businesses don't seem eligible, don't seem like they're treated as well by the powers that be. And now, like I said, I'm working on these, or I have been working on these federal issues, and it's involved thinking about the ways in which Amazon, for instance, has power over this community, like so many other communities, in a way that sometimes makes it harder for smaller businesses to stay afloat, or even puts them out of work. And yeah, I think the one moment I think back on was that speaks to a lot of this stuff is when we were trying to incubate a tech sector in Rhode Island, and we had like the big like tech incubators like the Y Combinators of the world are very successful, and they're out in Silicon Valley, or there's some in Colorado. Boston has some stuff going on, and we were in this moment where smaller and mid-sized cities were trying to figure out if they could do the same thing. And what we saw was there were a lot of really promising startups that came to exist here, leading on the universities or otherwise, and all but a handful of those that were successful found their way to one of those bigger hubs for a variety of different reasons. But that's where the capital was located, and it was also where the major firms whose businesses are, Google, Amazon, Facebook, a lot of their business is about monopolizing the sectors that they're in. And so they gobble up those smaller firms, remove them from cities like ours, plop them down in these handful of hubs. This is sort of the winner-take-all economy, where there are a handful of cities that win in these particular sectors. So I will say, just as an aside, there are also disruptions that happen there related to housing, gentrification questions that follow in a place like Seattle.
San Francisco's a little inexpensive right now, huh?
Yeah, no, exactly, and it's totally changed the nature of that city.
Yeah.
So they're winning from a monetary standpoint, but a lot of people are who are longer standing residents have been displaced. So there are some drawbacks, but here, of course, what we're seeing is that we try to incubate that sort of sector, and folks get up and go. I've had one or two friends who fought it out and be able to have like a satellite office here, where the bulk of the workforce for the firm that they help start is somewhere else, just because they love Providence so much. But these forces are disadvantage communities like ours, and on the whole advantage other communities. And a lot of that is a function of policy choices that the federal government has a lot of discretion over.
Excellent point. Well, when we start there, I think a huge piece of what you just said, I mean, you said a lot there. I'm just picking one thing out, is access to capital. Where do you see, because small businesses need that access, and we have the SBA and things of that nature, but where do you see that type of access something that the Congress could help with?
Yeah, I think more loan programs through the SBA, through HUD, CDBG has a lot of potential applications, and Providence, generally speaking, I would support more such programs. And another piece of the access to capital question is that there are a lot of private investors who want to invest in certain firms if they see them as competing with companies that are known for monopolizations. This is like called the kill zone effect. Again, most prominent in the tech sector, but applies in other sectors as well. So they just don't want to have anything to do with a company that they think is going to get undercut by a much bigger firm. And so there are ways that we can restructure the private markets in a way that allows for more ready capital formation by smaller and mid-sized firms over the course of their attempts to come into existence or grow.
Interesting. And when
another factor here, and it goes to consolidation, is that it's just harder in order to get loans because the banking sector has become so consolidated, and it's used to have these smaller hubs, people who knew their communities, cared about their communities, understood what the needs were, understood who was credit worthy, and those effects are for the most part no longer in play. And it's one of many factors that's led to a substantial decline in entrepreneurship over the course of the last 40 or 50 years. We've touched on a few others, but it's a surprising thing to a lot of people that we are, if you go back and look at what was happening 40 or 50 years ago, there were twice as many per capita new businesses starting every year as there are now. And we have only just over the last couple of years recovered back to the not pandemic, but pre-Great Recession, pre-08 or 09 level of new starts for for businesses, and a whole bunch of factors. We can speak to them in more detail if you want to play into that. But capital formation and the ability to find funding to start up is a huge one of them.
No, it's absolutely true. I think a lot of people don't realize that, especially here in Rhode Island. We're relatively fortunate in the sense that Rhode Island is such a huge, prominent spot for small business. It's still a struggle for many, but still a very prominent part of our economy is the small business. But if you go out to other states out west, you'll see it's a lot of the same franchises, conglomerates, chains, that sort of thing. But even like you mentioned with the banks, it's fascinating to realize, we have some pretty good small banks here, but like any forward-thinking financial organization, their ultimate goal is to be merged and become a conglomerate with another giant financial organization. I mean, that's the reality of it. It's just
it wasn't always that way. It doesn't need to be
right,
that way.
Right, it doesn't.
We've allowed for that to become the way that most or many investors in many sort of different sectors envision their out eventually coming. But
exactly.
Going public used to be an option, or just owning a successul business and having a revenue stream and being able to take a bit of profit off of that. But doing that for the bulk of one's life also used to be I of course think still is, but also used to be a very respectable standard thing for people to do. And so these are no longer what the expectations are for some people who start businesses. Of course, many people totally do want to do that, and we need to be doing more to help them. But it's also no longer the expectation for investors. Investors want to see massive returns, and they'll usually see that through an acquisition or through a firm going public, and that's not realistic for a lot of small businesses, and nor need it be.
True, absolutely true. How about the thinking? I had Mayor Policina on the show here maybe about a year ago almost, and obviously the Amazon building going up there in Johnston is a huge development. There's a lot of thinking behind that when you create something like that, you employ several hundred local people. Obviously, people that are here in Rhode Island, because they're not there will be some bringing in employees from other parts of the country, but mostly they're going to be locals, hopefully. The thinking is, and what Mayor Policina liked to talk about was that those locals that are now employed at that giant complex that Amazon is building in Johnston will then leave work at the end of the day and go and shop local and eat local and all those things. We're going to see if that plays out. It hasn't happened yet, but it does seem to add some credence when you look at like the citizens' headquarters or things of that nature.
And so what do I think about that line of argument? I mean, we're in this world where, again, we're contingent upon these massive companies to provide jobs because they've gobbled up all this energy, all of this like economic activity that used to exist in a much more distributed way, in a more in a way that used to allow for local economies to flourish. And so now we're begging these massive corporations for crumbs. These Amazon warehouse jobs. I mean, I have a lot of respect for the people who do them, but these are not high quality, well-paying jobs. They're incredibly stressful. There's an extraordinary amount of turnover, and we should be in a position where rather than having to build an economy around an Amazon warehouse, we're able to build an economy around a set of dozens of main streets across the state with businesses that are able to flourish despite the Amazons of the world, or in a world in which Amazon exists in a different form than it does today. And it's something that I noticed from my time on the city council and in various ways have tried to push back against, but it's a huge sort of, let's say, collective action problem where you have these companies that are just like jumping borders between states or threatening to jump borders between states, and using that to extract massive tax breaks, other concessions out of localities. We saw with the Amazon HQ2 fight, and in New York they pushed back, found that Amazon ended up moving at least a bunch of those jobs over there anyway. The Metro DC version moved forward. We saw when I was in office, Boeing did something very similar and basically put out an RFP that 30 or whatever states responded to, bidding each other down and offering more and more concessions, or in some cases perhaps even direct investment, to try to get a factory that was going to exist somewhere. And so we're chasing each other to the bottom, and the federal government come in and try to provide a solution. There could also be deals between states where they agree to stop poaching from one another. And New England is particularly susceptible to this in some ways because the states are so small, the border's so close. Right. The company can hop a state line without it necessarily disrupting even where their employees have to live. And so we need to push back against all of that in a variety of different ways, and among them by making it so that there are no longer these massive companies that monopolized so many markets in a way that makes it harder for rank and file businesses to exist, and requires, or at least it makes states and cities think that they have to fight for these headquarters or warehouses because it's so much harder than it should be to find engines for economic growth otherwise.
Well, as you said, we're not only are we fighting for these breadcrumbs, like you said, we're also giving away massive amounts of tax breaks at the same time. I don't think it's not so much that it's unfair. But the small businesses aren't seeing those same types of tax breaks. I mean, that's just the reality. We're not, none of us are seeing those types of concessions and assistance.
It is unfair. I mean, it's unfair that whether or not there should be subsidies across the board, is one question. But we should not live in a structure where the incentives are for lawmakers to give those massive tax breaks to the biggest companies, the ones who are already doing so well. And that's very much a part of those companies' business strategies. It's not some like accidental thing that happens. Like this
right.
is the plan. There are firms that help with the site location and help the whole consultancy built around specifically trying to help those massive companies figure out how to play states and cities off of each other to extract tax breaks. It's awful.
Yeah. So, in talking about small business, we look at, what goes across the state. Obviously, a congressional district and being in Congress is a little different for an effect. But so there are larger peripheral things, I think, that we've discussed here on the show with other candidates that do affect small business. And one of them is housing. I've had this discussion many times with lots of small business owners just in the last 2 weeks about how hard it is to find employees right now. It's insane to realize that our unemployment rate is so fantastically good, but yet no one can find anyone to hire. And affordable housing is something that often comes up, as does healthcare. To being able to draw these employees here. What are your thoughts on what can be done there, and where we are right now with housing and healthcare on the national level that can help Rhode Island out?
And it's housing, it's healthcare, it's transit, it's education.
Yep. Yeah. No, true. Absolutely true. Yeah. There's lots of big issues that people forget that sometimes when we talk small business, there's a lot of big issues that do affect the small business owner. So,
in another area, I'll speak to all of those or most of those anyway.
Yeah, as best you can. It could take us days, but go ahead. Yeah.
On the education side of things, of course, there's people, being educated, gaining skills, through college or through vocational training or otherwise. And then there's also the question of debt. And this goes back to, one of the many reasons why we're seeing so many fewer startups than we had historically. I mean, how are you going to start a new company if you come out of college and you've got $100,000 in debt hanging over your head? I mean, you're probably not going to be like credit worthy. You're going to be scared that you're going to fail and that you're going to become even more indebted on the other end of it, and it's going to ruin the rest of your life. And these are the choices people are facing, and it's ridiculous. And again, these are a function of policy choices that we've made. So I support free public college. I support free vocational training, and I support eliminating debt. At least to $50,000, for people who are still suffering from it now. I mean, as part of a broader framework, broader set of tactics for making the economy more fair and healthier for everybody. But we would see more entrepreneurship that would benefit communities, generally speaking, if we made college more affordable and we made it so that there was less debt hanging over people's heads. Housing, I think at the national level, the stats that I've seen are that we're about 4 million units shy of par right now, and we're somewhat worse than average in Rhode Island in terms of not having enough housing. And the federal government has extraordinary fiscal power. We saw it make use of it over the course of the pandemic. Some of that money, thankfully, is moving through the state and into housing development now. And we just need the federal government to play an active role. And it's going to be a mix of new construction, sometimes actively building new housing on its own, public, high quality public housing. And sometimes it's going to be subsidies through expansion of programs that already exist, like Section 8, for instance. But we need the government to play an active role in providing housing and incenting the private market to provide more housing too. What we're seeing with interest rates right now is disincentivizing the construction of new housing just as we need it most, in a way that is not going to decrease costs, right? Like housing is a tremendous percentage of what drives costs for a typical household. And if we have a world where there are going to be fewer new housing starts because we're jacking up interest rates, that's a real problem. And it's like certainly not helping address inflation. Transit, we need federal investment in public transit of a variety of different sorts, helping localities with buses and other forms of transit, and getting our rail up to a passable point. And what else was on your list?
Housing and healthcare.
Healthcare.
I was with a group of small business people last Thursday. We were discussing the hardships of trying to find new employees, and the fact that healthcare is tied to your job essentially in this country is it can be difficult.
Yeah, it's absurd. And this is I should have said earlier, the group that I've been running for the past 10 years, it's structured as a nonprofit, but it is effectively a small business, around 20 employees typically.
Sure.
And so I've had to deal with a lot of these issues on my own. We haven't had a centralized office of people work across the country, but of course finding healthcare and other benefits for employees is a huge part of what I've got to deal with, in addition to making sure that revenue's coming in and the high quality of work is being put out. I support Medicare for all for many reasons, but including the ones you just spoke to. Healthcare should not be tied to employment, and Medicare for all would be an extraordinary relief to business owners of all sizes, because their employees would have insurance, high quality insurance, like regardless of employment, and they wouldn't be responsible for finding the plans for themselves in the way that they are today. And I think I'm the only candidate in this race who's supporting Medicare for all. And I think that this is one of the aspects of what is so good about that program that isn't spoken to as broadly as it should be. Of course, we need people to have high quality healthcare for any number of reasons, and we should join the rest of the developed world in providing people with universal high quality healthcare access. But it also provides extraordinary help to our small business people as they try to make their businesses survive and provide for their employees and families and communities.
Good point. And then, of course, the flip side to asking all those questions and having, in my mind, answers that can progress us, in the right direction, is how do we pay for it all? What are your thoughts there? I mean, those are a lot of things you just got. And again, a short half-hour interview is not going to solve the world, but what are your thoughts?
Well, a whole lot of we could go to a dissertation on on how federal fiscal policy works, but it's very different from cities and states. The federal government has extraordinary fiscal power, again, as we saw over the course of the pandemic, and some of the things I'm talking about would lower costs substantially. So Medicare for all would lower costs on the order of 10%. So that is a deflationary measure. Better public transit would lower a lot of costs. We haven't really talked about the climate in general, but a transition to renewable energy would mean we don't have to deal with gas price driven inflation ever again. The demonopolization of the world would reduce costs, including for federal procurement. But a lot of the inflation we're seeing right now is a function of having afforded these firms pricing power. And so we see extraordinary profits being extracted that otherwise wouldn't be able to if we actually had competitive markets with lots of smaller mid-sized firms. So there are a million ways to pay for these things. It's a matter of having the will to do so.
I didn't hear you bring up one that I'm sure is probably dear to your campaign is. And I know no one wants to talk about raising taxes by any means, but when I see the numbers, I don't know a single small business owner who makes over $2 million a year on their own. Maybe their business does, but we're not talking business taxes. We're talking personal taxes. Yep. What are your thoughts there?
I support a wealth tax on the very wealthy. There are several different proposals out there. I support raising taxes on households of more than 400,000 a year, which was the Trump. We're restoring higher taxes to people who make over 400,000 a year, and perhaps going somewhat further. And there were a variety of different measures, even just over the course of the last few weeks during the debate about the Inflation Reduction Act that is now moving through Congress, where we saw the carried interest loophole was going to be closed. This is something that applies really just to people who are fund managers. It applies to Wall Street.
Right.
And we had one senator refused to allow that through. There was another proposal for a minimum tax of 15% on corporations that make more than $1 billion a year, which I obviously support. And much of that made it through, but then there was at the last minute a carve out for private equity that passed. And so there are all kinds of opportunities to increase revenues as well, which I of course support and should have spoken to at the outset. But I think that it's important to talk about how a lot of people think like, Medicare for all, it's a huge, it's going to drive up costs, or that's going to increase inflation. How will the government afford it? And we pay way more for healthcare than other developed countries do. And so Medicare for all is actually potentially deflationary, and in many respects saves governments, federal, state, and local money relative to certain things they're spending on right now.
Well, you just brought up a something that I think needs to be addressed. I've asked this again to the other candidates running for this district, and we'll continue to ask this. You mentioned the act going through Congress right now. Just went through the Senate, but one piece was changed by one person. How do you feel? You can be effective in a Congress that is so clearly, a mess. I mean, let's be honest about it. I don't know. There's a nice way to put it. How do you think that you can work in this climate going on right now in our Congress?
So, well, one, the next Congress will be different. Maybe
True.
For better, maybe for worse. We'll see soon.
We'll see. Right.
But a couple extra Democratic senators make a huge difference. What about the possibility of doing a ton more than we've been able to achieve over the course of the last couple of years? Again, presuming that we hold the House, and we need to fight it out. By no means this is a given, but it seems like the political climate is improving for Democrats, perhaps a little bit, in part because they are demonstrating that they're actually able to deliver on things that don't necessarily go as far as I would like, but it's important that Democrats are making progress on some key issues now. I would also say that I've served in office under a right-wing governor. I was in office during the Kacheri administration, nonetheless was able to move things forward around renewable energy, around criminal justice reform. We even made some progress on LGBTQ rights.
So it happens to all of us, believe me.
And a bill that I got through over the governor's veto to expand rights. And I think it was one of the few major advances that we made over the course of my time in office. It wasn't easy. It involved building broad, coalitions, sometimes with people who I didn't agree with on every single issue. But we were able to find common ground in places that were unexpected. Another example is pushing back against cuts during the economic crisis of 11, 12 years ago. I built a coalition of progressives, but also traditional Democrats to push back against really severe cuts that were being purveyed. And we didn't win on everything, but we were able to blunt them substantially and make a real difference for cities and towns and the residents and small businesses within them. And at the federal level, I've been working on a whole bunch of different issues. But again, I'm going to go back to the monopoly point, because I think it's one of the ones that's most relevant to the question of small businesses. It's a place where we find a lot of bipartisan esteem. So we have bills moving through, again, the House and Senate, with Republicans and Democrats, both willing to push back against the power of the major tech companies in particular. But there's a broader critique accumulating, because even Republicans in energy states or in ag states see what's happening to small farms or to energy producers as these conglomerates gobble up so many competitors. So I figured out ways to work on a variety of different issues under various permutations of government, and I think I would be able to make a difference in Congress too.
Well, thank you for that answer. That was great. I appreciate the conversation. Is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I just really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. So thanks for having me on, and happy to do it again down the line.
Oh, thank you. Best of luck on the rest of the campaign. Reminder to everyone watching this, the primary is Tuesday, September 13th. So head out on Tuesday, September 13th, or sooner. You can start voting in certain cities and towns. You can vote sooner. But the primary date is Tuesday, September 13th. David Segal, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
So thanks again for watching. Really appreciate it. Again, head to risbc.org to sign up, and we'll talk to you next time. Take care.